If you enjoy stories that lull you into a peculiar state of half-sleep, where the line between history and absurdity blurs like the edges of a dream, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more tales that are just unsettling enough to keep you company in the dark. Tonight's story is the first chapter in a series about the peculiar inconveniences of sharing a home with a ghost who refuses to be anything less than painfully courteous. Chapter 1. The Unseen Roommate. The first time I realized I was living with a ghost, it was not because of any chilling draft, disembodied whisper, or flickering light. No, it was because I came home to find my favorite armchair slightly askew, as though someone had just risen from it, and a note on the coffee table that read, "Apologies for the intrusion. I hope you don't mind. I needed a place to sit while you were out. Yours, respectfully, E." As I would come to know him, or her, or it. Ghosts are notoriously vague about pronouns, was not the sort of specter one might expect. There were no rattling chains, no mournful wails echoing down the hall at midnight. Instead, there was an overwhelming sense of politeness that permeated the house, a kind of oppressive decorum that made even the most mundane activities feel like a formal tea party hosted by a particularly anxious Victorian butler. Take, for instance, the matter of the kitchen. One does not expect to negotiate with the dead over the proper way to stack dishes, and yet there I was, opening the cupboard to find my haphazard pile of plates rearranged into a neat symmetrical tower, with another note tucked beneath the top one. I took the liberty of organizing these. I hope it meets with your approval. If not, please leave a note indicating your preferred arrangement. Warm regards. At first, I assumed this was some elaborate prank. Perhaps a former tenant with a key had decided to haunt me in the most bureaucratic way possible. But as the days passed, the evidence mounted. My books, which I had deliberately left in a state of creative chaos, were reshelved alphabetically by author. My laundry, which I had dumped unceremoniously on the floor, was folded into precise squares and placed on the dresser with yet another note. I couldn't help but notice these were in disarray. I hope you don't mind my assistance. Sincerely, E. The real trouble began when I tried to argue. I said aloud one evening, addressing the empty room as though it were a particularly stubborn customer service representative. I appreciate the help, but I'd really prefer if you didn't touch my things. There was a long silence. Then, from somewhere near the ceiling, came a soft, almost embarrassed cough. A sheet of paper fluttered down from the air, landing gracefully at my feet. It read, "My deepest apologies. I had no wish to overstep. It shan't happen again. Regretfully." For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. Here was a ghost trapped in some liminal state between life and whatever comes after, and all it wanted to do was tidy up. But that guilt evaporated the next morning when I found my coffee maker unplugged and another note. I noticed this was left on overnight. For safety's sake, I took the liberty of turning it off. I hope you understand. Respectfully, E. It was then that I realized the true horror of living with a polite ghost. There was no fighting it. A malevolent spirit you could rage against. A mischievous one you could outwit. But a ghost that apologized for existing? That left little notes like a passive-aggressive housemate from the 19th century. That was a foe against which there was no defense. And so, I resigned myself to a life of minor, courteous intrusions. My shoes were always lined up by the door, perfectly parallel. My bed was made with hospital corners, even when I deliberately left it unmade. Once I even caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure dusting the top of the bookshelf, only for it to vanish the moment I gasped, leaving behind a faint scent of lavender and a note that said, "Pardon the disturbance. Best wishes, E." The most unsettling part was how relentlessly considerate it all was. I began to dread coming home. not because of any supernatural terror, but because I knew I'd find yet another small, polite violation of my privacy waiting for me. It was like living with a ghostly mother-in-law who couldn't resist straightening your tie or wiping a smudge off your cheek. Only this one could phase through walls and had presumably been dead for at least a century. By the end of the first month, I was exhausted. I'd taken to leaving notes of my own, things like, "Dearie, please don't water the plants, they're succulents," or "The mess on my desk is intentional. Kindly ignore it." But it was no use. The ghost was determined to be helpful, and I was trapped in an endless loop of supernatural hospitality. The breaking point came when I woke up one night to the sound of faint scratching. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, only to see a pen floating in midair, moving across a piece of paper on my nightstand. I watched, frozen, as the pen settled neatly beside the note, which then levitated toward me. With trembling hands I took it. It read, "I noticed you were shivering. May I adjust the thermostat? Yours in service. East." That was the moment I knew. Living with a polite ghost was worse than living with a vengeful one. At least a vengeful ghost had the decency to be upfront about its intentions. Chapter 2. The Ghost Who Always Knocks. If there was one thing more maddening than a ghost who tidied your belongings without permission, it was a ghost who absolutely refused to enter a room uninvited. You would think that being dead would grant a spirit certain liberties, facing through walls, drifting silently through keyholes, appearing suddenly in mirrors with a dramatic flair. But not no. He treated every closed door like a sacred barrier, something that could only be crossed with explicit consent. The first time it happened, I was in the bath. The water was warm, the candles were flickering, and I had just settled into that perfect state of half-submerged relaxation when I heard it. 3 polite, deliberate knocks on the bathroom door. "Come in," I said instinctively before remembering that I lived alone. Well, technically, the door did not open. There was no spectral hand turning the knob, no eerie mist creeping beneath the threshold. Just another knock, slightly more hesitant this time. I sighed. If that's you, you don't have to knock. You're a ghost. You can just float in." A moment of silence. Then from the other side of the door came a soft, muffled voice. Not quite audible, more like the impression of words, as if spoken through a thick blanket. Another knock followed. Grumbling, I pulled myself out of the bath, wrapped a towel around my waist, and yanked the door open. There was no one there, of course. But on the floor, as expected, lay a note. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you. I didn't wish to intrude. May I enter to retrieve the errant sock under the sink? It's been bothering me. Humbly, E." I stared at the note, then down at the sock in question, a lone, crumpled thing that had indeed been languishing under the sink for days. I had no memory of putting it there. I said to the empty hallway, "You're a ghost. You could have just taken it." Another pause. Then, from the air beside me, came the faintest sensation of someone clearing their throat. A new note materialized in midair and drifted into my hand. Would have been rude. And so it went. Every closed door became an ordeal. If I shut myself in my office to work, within 10 minutes there would be a gentle tapping, followed by a note slid underneath. "Pardon the interruption. Might I enter to straighten the curtains?" If I retreated to my bedroom for a nap, just as I was drifting off, 3 soft raps would sound and another scrap of paper would appear. "Ye noticed a draft. May I adjust the window? I shan't take but a moment." The worst part was that ignoring the knocks did nothing. He would not enter without permission, but he would also not stop asking. Once, in a fit of frustration, I locked myself in the pantry just to see what would happen. Within minutes, the knocking began. Light, patient, relentless. I waited. The knocking continued. 10 minutes passed. 20. By the half-hour mark, the knocks had taken on a rhythmic, almost plaintive quality. Not angry, not demanding, just persistently polite, like a very well-mannered woodpecker. Finally, unable to take it anymore, I threw open the door. What? No ghost. Just another note, this one slightly wrinkled, as if he had been clutching it in spectral distress. Gee, I feared you might be unwell. I didn't wish to alarm you, but the pantry has poor ventilation. Might I suggest a brief respite in the drawing room? Concernedly, It was enough to make me miss the days of traditional hauntings. At least a poltergeist would have just thrown a jar of pickles at my head and been done with it. The real problem, I realize, was that E's insistence on propriety made Ame feel like the rude one. Here was this poor dead thing, trapped in some eternal purgatory of etiquette, and I was the boorish living oaf who couldn't even muster the decency to say, "Yes, E, you may enter," and hover judgmentally near the bookshelves for a while. One evening, in a desperate bid for privacy, I tried reasoning with it. "E," I announced to the empty parlor, "I appreciate your manners, really. I do. But you don't need to knock. You're a spirit. The laws of physics don't apply to you." A long silence. Then from the grandfather clock, which he had taken to winding every Thursday, came the sound of faint scribbling. A note slipped out from behind the clock face. "But the laws of decency do." I groaned. "Eh? I'm giving you blanket permission right now, for the rest of time. You may enter any room at any moment without knocking. Consider this my eternal ghostly hall pass." Another pause. Then from the chandelier, a single note fluttered down like a falling leaf. "What's very kind, but it wouldn't be proper. What if you were in a state of undress? I live alone, eher. Ebenso." And so the knocking continued. Every day, every hour. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I jolt awake to 3 soft taps on the bedroom door, followed by a note slipped underneath. "Apologies for the hour. The hallway painting is slightly crooked. May I fix it?" I began to wonder about E's life before death. Had they been a butler, a governess, a particularly fastidious monk? There was no way this level of decorum was learned in the afterlife. This was the product of a lifetime of repressed politeness, a soul so burdened by social niceties that not even death could free them. One night after the 7th round of knocks, this time regarding a concerning tilt in the hat stand, I finally snapped. "E," I shouted at the ceiling. "If you don't stop knocking, I'm moving out." The house fell silent. For the first time since E had arrived, there was no immediate response. No note. No phantom throat clearing. Just stillness. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt a pang of guilt. Had I been too harsh? Had I wounded E's spectral sensibilities? Then, just as I was about to apologize, I heard it, a single hesitant knock on the front door. It's a front door. As if A had left the house entirely just to knock properly before re-entering. A note slid under the door. "Might I come in?" I buried my face in my hands. There was no winning. And so, with a sigh, I did the only thing I could. I opened the door. Chapter 3. The Haunted Tea Party. I should have known that a ghost as devoted to etiquette as E would eventually take up entertaining. It started innocently enough, a single china cup appearing on the kitchen counter, still warm to the touch, as though someone had just set it down after a sip. Next came the saucers, materializing in odd places, balanced on the arm of the sofa, perched on a windowsill, once even stacked neatly inside the icebox, as if he had hosted a very confused specter who believed refrigeration improved tea flavor. But the real trouble began the morning I woke to the sound of clinking porcelain. I followed the noise to the parlor and froze in the doorway. The coffee table had been dragged to the center of the room and set with an elaborate tea service that most certainly did not belong to me. Delicate cups with floral patterns, a tiered tray bearing phantom crumbs of invisible scones, and a teapot steaming gently despite having no heat source beneath it. The air smelled faintly of bergamot, and something distinctly old, like a grandmother's handkerchief pulled from a century-old drawer. And then there were the chairs. Every seat in the house had been arranged around the table, including the heavy oak dining chair. I could barely lift myself. They were all slightly askew, as though recently vacated by unseen guests. A note rested on the table, written in ease-looping script. "I hope you don't mind the gathering. The Mrs. Pembleton and Dr. Holloway were in the neighborhood. Do help yourself to the remaining cakes, there by the window. Yours in hospitality, E." I looked at the window. There were no cakes. Just a single sad napkin with a lace edge, folded into a shape that might have been a swan in a more ambitious originist's hands. The next day it happened again. This time I returned from the grocer's to find the kitchen in disarray. Sugar scattered across the counter, milk spilled in suspiciously circular patterns, as though a cup had been knocked over and hastily righted, and a teaspoon standing straight up in the jam jar. Another note. Apologies for the mess. The Colonel got into a debate about the Boer War. Things grew spirited. I'll tidy shortly. Regretfully, E.G. I stared at the note, then at the jam-coated teaspoon. "Eh?" I said aloud. "Who the hell is the Colonel?" No answer. Just the faintest echo of laughter, or perhaps a cough, from the direction of the pantry. By the third week, the tea parties had become a daily ordeal. I'd stumbled downstairs to find the furniture rearranged into perfect little conversational clusters, the curtains drawn to allow for a more pleasant atmosphere, yet another note, and on one memorable occasion, a lace doily pinned to the wall with a decorative hairpin. Beneath it, in shaky handwriting, Lady Whitsun insisted it was just the thing for the space. I suspect she may be right. Admiringly, E. The worst part was the phantom gossip. I'd be reading in my armchair when a draft would rush past my ear like a whispered yand. Then he didn't even write her a letter. Can you imagine? Or I'd walk past the hall mirror and catch a flicker of movement. Not my reflection, but the impression of a woman in a high-necked dress fanning herself vigorously, while another shadowy figure leaned in to murmur, I tried protesting. "Hey, I don't mind you having friends over, but must they rearrange my furniture? And who keeps drinking all my milk?" A note appeared on the mantel. "Why the Admiral prefers a dash in his Earl Grey. I've taken the liberty of adding it to the grocery list. Gratefully, E.E." I checked the list. Beneath bread and eggs, in handwriting that definitely wasn't mine, was written milk, extra, for guests. Then came the séance. I awoke at 2 a.m. to the sound of rhythmic tapping. Not as usual polite knocks. This was sharper, more deliberate. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. I followed the noise to the parlor, where every candle in the house had been lit and the chairs had been pushed back to form a perfect circle. In the center sat my Ouija board, which I did not own, and a note. "Hi, the Mrs. Pembleton wishes to contact her sister in the beyond. We shan't be long. Do join us if you'd like. Warmly, E." I watched in horror as the planchette began moving on its own, sliding smoothly to hello before I turned on my heel and went back to bed. Some things even a ghost's politeness couldn't make me endure. By month's end, I'd resigned myself to the chaos. I'd wake to find sugar cubes stacked into miniature pyramids by the sugar bowl, the Admiral's doing, apparently, or the newspaper folded to the crossword with half the clues filled in ink that faded if you looked at it too long. Once, I even caught the tail end of an argument, 2 indistinct voices hissing, "I told you not to mention the incident with the vicar," before cutting off the moment I entered the room. The final straw came when I found an RSVP card on my pillow. Crisp ivory cardstock, embossed with swirling letters. Pleasure of your company is requested at the annual Spectral Garden Party. June 17th. Noon. Dress. Ethereal. I turned the card over. In his handwriting at the bottom, "Ye do say you'll come. The Admiral has wagered you won't. Fondly, ease." I stared at it for a long moment. Then, very deliberately, I took a pen from my nightstand and wrote "I depends, will there be real cake this time?" before setting it on the dresser. It was gone by morning. In its place was a single spectral mint, wrapped in paper that disintegrated the moment I touched it. I sighed and added Exorcist to the grocery list. Just in case. Chapter 4. The Apology Poltergeist. It was bad enough living with a ghost who threw tea parties for invisible aristocrats. It was worse when that ghost developed a habit of apologizing for every single supernatural occurrence, no matter how minor. The first time it happened, I was reading in bed when the lamp flickered. A perfectly normal flicker, the sort caused by an aging bulb or a passing breeze. But before I could even glance up, a note materialized mid-air and fluttered onto my book. "In most sincere apologies for the disruption. The Admiral insists on practicing his Morse code. I've asked him to cease. Profoundly regretful, E. Watt." I stared at the note, then at the perfectly still lamp. "E," I said to the empty room, "it was just a flicker. You don't need to apologize for that." A pause. Then another note, this one drifting down from the ceiling like a falling leaf. "One must always acknowledge one's disturbances. It's only proper." From that moment on, every creak, every groan of the house, every faint whisper of wind through the eaves was followed by an immediate apology. The floorboards groaned under unseen footsteps. A note would slip out from beneath the sofa. "Terribly sorry for the noise. Miss Pembleton's corset is giving her trouble again. We're attempting quieter steps. Humbly, ye." A book fell from the shelf for no discernible reason. Before it even hit the ground, a scrap of paper would float down beside it. "Our deepest regrets." The Colonel was reaching for a treatise on naval strategy and misjudged the distance. "He sends his regards. Penitently, E. U." The worst part was the sheer volume of notes. I'd wake to find them stuffed under my door, tucked into my slippers, even folded inside my cereal box. Once I opened the fridge to find a note stuck to the milk carton with what looked like ectoplasmic adhesive. "Oh, apologies for the chill. Lady Whitson insisted on proper refrigeration conditions for the blancmange. It won't happen again. Contritely, E." I tried explaining that I didn't need an apology for every little thing. "Eh?" I said to the apparently empty hallway. "You're a ghost. A certain amount of spookiness is expected. You don't have to." A note dropped onto my head from above. "But one must maintain standards." Even the weather wasn't safe. A particularly strong gust of wind rattled the window panes one night, and by morning I found a note on the sill, written in a shaky hand as though composed in distress. "Give us accept my humblest apologies for last night's draft. The Admiral attempted to air out the stuffiness and got carried away. We've since reviewed." The breaking point came when I stubbed my toe on the bedpost. It was entirely my own fault. I'd been shuffling to the bathroom half asleep, but before I could even curse, a note materialized on the nightstand. "A 1,000 pardons for the unfortunate placement of furniture. I've taken the liberty of adjusting the bed 2 inches to the left to prevent future incidents. Your comfort is paramount. Abjectly." I looked at the bed. It had, indeed, been moved. "Eh?" I groaned. "You didn't have to." Another note. She did, E. It was maddening. The constant apologies made every mundane moment feel like I was trapped in some bizarre supernatural customer service loop. Once, after a particularly long day, I sighed heavily while washing dishes. only for a note to appear in the soapsuds.
He said dissatisfaction.
Have we offended? Please specify grievances for immediate rectification. Anxiously, E. I began to suspect he wasn't just apologizing for their spectral housemates, but for the very fact of their existence. A door would close softly on its own, and a note would appear. Apologies for the presumption of movement. A shadow would pass across the wall, and another scrap of paper would flutter down. Regrets for the unsolicited shade. One night, in a fit of desperation, I tried preemptive absolution. I announced, I hereby forgive you in advance for any and all ghostly activities. No more apologies needed. The house fell silent. For one blissful moment, I thought I'd solved it. Then, from the grandfather clock, came the sound of frantic scribbling. A note shot out like it had been fired from a cannon, landing at my feet. But what if were too forgiven? What if our lack of remorse appears disrespectful? The social implications are paralyzing. In crisis, I put my head in my hands. There was no winning. The final straw came at 3 a.m. when I was jolted awake by the sound of a full tea set smashing to the floor in the parlor. Before the last saucer had stopped spinning, a note materialized on my pillow, damp with what I hoped was spectral tears. Catastrophic apologies. The colonel and admiral came to blows over the crumpet supply. We'll replace everything. Expect full reparations by noon. In utter disgrace, I stared at the note, then at my ceiling. Somewhere above me I could hear the faint sounds of an argument. Two indistinct voices hissing G told you the Devon recipe was superior, and you insufferable, before being cut off by what sounded like a spectral hand clapping over mouths. I sighed and reached for my pen. I wrote on the back of the note, maybe we should schedule a house meeting. The reply appeared instantly beneath my words, in handwriting that trembled with relief. Agreed. Shall we say Tuesday? The Mrs. Pembleton has a prior engagement with her seance circle, but the rest of us are free. Gratefully, E. I closed my eyes. I had created a monster. A polite, overly apologetic, utterly unstoppable monster. And the worst part, I was starting to feel guilty every time I didn't acknowledge their apologies. The next time a note appeared, regrets for the lingering chill in the pantry. Lady Whitson is experimenting with icebox cake concepts. I caught myself writing no worries before I even realized what I was doing. I stared at my own handwriting in horror. E had won. Chapter 5. The Ghostly Houseguest Who Overstays. There comes a moment in every haunting when one must face an uncomfortable truth. Ghosts don't pay rent, nor do they understand the concept of lease agreements, personal space, or the fact that their continued presence might be considered, by the living at least, to be somewhat inconsiderate. E had long since crossed the threshold from temporary supernatural nuisance to permanent spectral resident, and what made it unbearable wasn't the haunting itself, but E's complete refusal to acknowledge being dead at all. I first noticed the depth of E's delusion when I caught them attempting to do laundry. Not ghost laundry, not some phantom petticoat or ectoplasmic cravat, but my laundry, my very corporeal, very much a live person's laundry. I walked into the basement to find the washing machine already running, a neat row of my shirts hanging on a line that most definitely hadn't been there before, and a note pinned to the ironing board. E took the liberty of starching your Sunday best. One must keep up appearances. Your faithful housemate, E. Full House. The shirts were immaculate. The collars stood at perfect right angles. The creases could have cut glass. And floating nearby was the faintest shimmer of disapproval when I dared to wear one with jeans. "Hey," I said carefully, addressing the empty basement, "you do realize you're a ghost, don't you?" A long silence. Then the washing machine lid opened by itself, and a new note floated out. "Wow, what an odd question. Of course I am not a ghost. Ghosts rattle chains and moan in attics. I'm simply a long-term guest assisting with household duties." I stared at the note, then at the floating iron that was currently pressing a pair of my boxer shorts with military precision. "Yea," I tried again. "Normal guests don't phase through walls, or materialize starch from the Edwardian era." The iron paused mid-air. Another note appeared, this one written in what I'd come to recognize as E's defensive handwriting, slightly larger, with emphatic underlines. Modern architecture is full of hidden passages. "And everyone knows the best starch comes from Mrs. Beaton's 1861 recipe. Are you feeling quite well? Perhaps you need to lie down?" Thus began the most infuriating haunting in history. Not because the ghost didn't understand it was dead, but because it insisted on being the world's most proactive housemate. Every morning I'd wake to find breakfast laid out. Proper Edwardian breakfasts, with kippers and poached eggs and toast cut into soldiers, all completely inedible because they were ghost food that turned to mist when touched. My shoes were always polished to a mirror shine with phantom wax. My mail was neatly stacked and pre-sorted by a spectral hand that took particular umbrage at junk mail, which would often reappear shredded in the bin with notes like, "These modern solicitors lack all decorum." The breaking point came when I returned home to find E had invited guests. Not the usual spectral tea party crowd. Actual living guests. Mrs. Henderson from next door was sitting stiffly on my sofa, a teacup trembling in her hands, while the curtains fluttered with no open windows to explain it. The room smelled strongly of lavender and existential dread. "Ah, there you are." Mrs. Henderson nearly leapt up when I entered. "Your housemate was just telling me about your mutual arrangement." I looked at the empty armchair where a depression in the cushions suggested someone, or something, had recently been sitting. A notepad on the coffee table floated up and scribbled rapidly before showing me the message. "Mrs. Henderson brought over zucchini bread. I've put the recipe in your file for future reference." Mrs. Henderson's smile was the strained expression of someone who had seen the laws of physics violated repeatedly and was trying very hard to be polite about it. "Your Mr. Everard has been most attentive." "Mr. Everard?" I mouthed at the notepad. Another scribble. "Everard, really must you embarrass me in front of company?" Over the next month, his delusion only deepened. They began leaving notes about our household budget, complete with Victorian spending categories like candles and servants' wages. They took up gardening, or rather rearranged my potted plants into elaborate parterres that wilted overnight from supernatural interference. Once, I caught them attempting to pay the milkman with coins that turned to dust in the poor man's hand. The final straw was the dinner party. I came home to find my dining table extended to twice its normal length, set with my best china, which I didn't own, and enough silverware to confuse a diplomat. At the head of the table, my chair had been replaced with an ornate wingback that smelled faintly of mothballs and mortality. Notes fluttered around the room like confused butterflies. "We Thompsons arrive at 7:30, and A.D.O. try to wear the navy waistcoat, and most alarmingly, remember, no discussing politics, or the incident with the parlor maid." "Hey," I said to the empty room, my voice dangerously calm. "We need to talk about your situation." The notes stopped mid-air. The silverware paused in its phantom polishing. A deathly silence fell over the dining room. A single notepad floated toward me, pencils scratching furiously. If this is about the rent, I've left my share in the biscuit tin. I opened the tin. It was full of dead leaves and a single tarnished shilling from 1897. That night, as I lay in bed, a final note slipped under my door. G may not be the most modern of companions, but this is my home too. I keep it properly. I contribute to its upkeep. And I'll thank you to remember that. Good night.
Good night, night.
I stared at the note for a long time. Then, with a sigh, I got up and went to the kitchen. I put the kettle on, properly, in the whistling stovetop one he preferred, and set out 2 cups. One for me. One for no one. When I returned later, my cup was empty. The other was still full. But the teaspoon resting across its saucer suggested someone, or something, had at least considered drinking. I sighed and added ghost therapist to the grocery list. This was clearly going to be a long-term arrangement. Chapter 6. The Phantom Complimenter. There is something uniquely unsettling about being praised by the dead. Not the dramatic echoing compliments of a gothic romance ghost. No whispered, "You are the most exquisite creature to ever grace these halls," while standing dramatically on the staircase. But the mundane, relentless positivity of a specter who has apparently taken a correspondence course in motivational speaking from beyond the grave. It began subtly enough. I would burn my toast as living people do, and instead of the usual passive-aggressive note about proper toasting techniques, a scrap of paper would float down from the ceiling. And it brings out the rustic charm of the bread. Very artisanal. I would trip over my own feet, as living people do. And before I could even curse, a note would slide out. At first, I assumed this was E's attempt at being supportive. Then I realized with dawning horror that E wasn't just being polite. Yeah, was a complimenter. A relentless, unstoppable, compulsive complimenter. The worst part was how unnervingly specific the praise became. I would stare blankly into the fridge, debating whether cold baked beans counted as a meal, and a note would materialize on the shelf beside the ketchup. Your restraint in the face of culinary mediocrity is inspiring. Such discipline. I would sigh dramatically while folding laundry, and another note would appear tucked into a sock. The way you pair patterns is truly... Even my failures were met with enthusiasm. I once attempted to fix a leaky faucet and succeeded only in flooding the bathroom. Before the water could even seep under the door, a note floated down from the shower rod. What an innovative approach to indoor water features. The Admiral is taking notes for his next garden party. I tried protesting. "Hey," I said to the apparently empty kitchen, "you don't have to compliment everything I do. Sometimes things are just bad." A pause. Then the spice rack rattled, and a new note fluttered out from behind the cumin. "Your self-awareness is breathtaking. Such emotional intelligence." It was maddening. The compliments weren't even Ebed Goode compliments. They were the kind of vague, over-enthusiastic praise one might give a child who has just finger-painted a blob and declared it a masterpiece. Once, in a fit of frustration, I deliberately wore mismatched shoes all day, waiting for E's inevitable note. Sure enough, by noon, one appeared tucked into my waistband. How delightful! A playful subversion of podiatric norms. "The Colonel is green with envy." I groaned. "Eh? The Colonel is already green? He's a ghost." Another note, this one drifting down from the ceiling fan. "Your grasp of spectral biology is remarkable." The breaking point came when I caught myself trying to earn his praise. I would pause dramatically before eating a sad sandwich, waiting for the inevitable note about my thoughtful pacing or appreciation of simple pleasures. I caught myself staging bad outfits just to see what creative spin he would put on them. Once, I even pretended to read a book upside down just to see if he would call it a revolutionary approach to literature. They did. The final straw was the haircut. I trimmed my own bangs, badly. We've all been there. One moment of misguided confidence with the scissors, and suddenly you look like a startled Victorian urchin. I stared at my reflection in dismay, mentally preparing a list of hats I could wear for the next month. Before I could even sigh, a note slid out from behind the mirror. "What daring asymmetry!" the Mrs. Pembleton swooned. I grabbed the note and crumpled it. "Hey, this isn't daring asymmetry. It's a mistake." Silence. Then the bathroom door creaked open by itself, and another note fluttered in, this one written in what I'd come to recognize as E's serious handwriting, slightly firmer, with fewer flourishes. "My dear friend, you must understand, in my day a bad haircut could ruin a reputation forever. The fact that you face the world with such confidence, regardless." I stared at the note, then at my reflection, then back at the note. I sighed and reached for a hat. That night, as I lay in bed, a final note slipped under my door. "Your ability to accept compliments is improving beautifully. A true inspiration to us all." I groaned and pulled the pillow over my head. A had won again. Chapter 7. The Etiquette of Ectoplasm. One does not simply cohabitate with a ghost of E's particular sensibilities, without eventually being subjected to a rigorous education in spectral decorum. It began, as most of E's impositions did, with a note, this one delivered not by fluttering dissent, but mounted in an ornate frame that materialized overnight above the mantelpiece, as though it had always been there. The heading read in elaborate calligraphy, "I.A. Gentleman's Guide to Proper Spectral Comportment, Revised Edition 1897. The first rule was, naturally, about knocking. Not the polite but unnecessary door-rapping he had previously insisted upon, but rather the correct way for a ghost to announce itself when passing through solid matter. K.I. Specter of quality. The guide proclaimed, never simply phases through walls without first telegraphing his intention with a subtle clearing of the throat, or equivalent ethereal vibration. Sudden appearances are the mark of common haunts and street corner apparitions. I discovered this rule the hard way when, mid-shower, the bathroom tiles emitted a faint yam, before E's disembodied hand materialized just long enough to leave a note on the sink. "Pardon the intrusion. The Admiral wished to remind you that the hot water heater is set 3 degrees too high. For proper conservation." The second rule concerned titles. It turned out A was short for Cod-I-E, Honorable Everett Everard, and my continued use of the initial was, according to another framed note that appeared beside my toothbrush, I.A. lamentable modern informality, when I had pointed out that Jeverett was a ridiculous name for a ghost. The bathroom mirror fogged up to write, "Be better Everett than Bartholomew," which is what. By week's end, the house had become a minefield of supernatural propriety. Walking through a doorway too briskly might earn a note about unseemly haste. Leaving a book splayed open on the couch prompted a hovering bookmark and a lecture delivered via a series of notes in increasingly ornate script about irrespect for the printed word. Even my breathing came under scrutiny. One evening, as I sighed over a burnt dinner, the recipe book flipped open of its own accord. The most absurd rule, however, concerned the proper handling of ectoplasm. I wouldn't have even known ectoplasm, or was a concern, had I not woken to find the hallway lined with small, lace-trimmed towels, and a sign reading J4 Spectral Residue. Beneath it, a note explained, "While true gentlemen ghosts produce minimal discharge, even the best of us may occasionally experience drips. I stared at the towels, then at the empty hallway. I called. Are you telling me ghosts leak? The chandelier tinkled in a way that suggested offended dignity. A note drifted down. Gray preferred the term gemanates, and only in circumstances of extreme emotion or poor spiritual digestion. Matters came to a head during what I can only describe as a supernatural dinner party. I returned home to find the dining table set with an alarming number of forks, each labeled with tiny name tags like E-Fish Apparition and Ectoplasmic Entree, and a place card at the head of the table that read, "Gemster living hosting," in what was unmistakably sarcastic quotation marks. A note waited on my chair. "Unite, we shall practice proper cross-dimensional dining etiquette. You will find the Spectral Human Interactions manual beneath your serviette. Kindly review Chapter 12. When to pretend not to see a floating knifing." Before the soup course, I sat through 7 courses of invisible food, each accompanied by increasingly ridiculous instructions. Always pass the salt counterclockwise when serving spirits. Never acknowledge a ghost spilled wine unless it stains your clothing, in which case a discreet "I believe your dribbling" is acceptable. The final straw came during dessert, when I was instructed in the proper way to decline phantom pudding. Involves 3 firm and a thank you see and a gesture toward one's corporeal stomach. Exhausted, I finally snapped. This is ridiculous." "You're dead. I'm alive. Why does any of this matter?" The room fell silent. The floating dessert spoon froze mid-air. Then, from the grandfather clock, came the sound of slow, deliberate writing. A final note emerged, written not in its usual looping script, but in tight, careful letters. "Because without rules, we are all just shadows in the dark, and I refuse to be just a shadow." I stared at the note for a long time. Then, with a sigh, I picked up the correct fork, third from the left, ghostly grievances, and tapped it twice against my water glass. But if I have to learn spectral etiquette, you're learning modern plumbing. That wahem in the shower was traumatizing. The spoon dipped in what might have been a nod. And for the first time since he had arrived, the house didn't feel haunted, just occupied by a very particular, very proper dead man. I reached for the invisible pudding. Some battles weren't worth fighting. Chapter 8. The Ghost Who Insists on Paying Rent. The first time I found the coin on my nightstand, I thought nothing of it. Just an old, tarnished penny that must have fallen out of my pocket. But when I woke the next morning to find it replaced by a silver 3p from 1876, polished to a mirror shine and resting atop a scrap of parchment reading "Gie First Installment," I realized he had developed a new obsession, financial responsibility. By week's end, my house had become something between a numismatic collection and an archaeological dig. Coins appeared in my slippers, beneath my pillow, once even balanced precariously on the rim of my coffee cup, always antique, always meticulously cleaned, always accompanied by some variation of A for household expenses, or a variation of A keep of the drawing room. The denominations grew increasingly absurd. A gold sovereign from Victoria's reign, tucked into the sugar bowl, a Spanish doubloon wedged between. I tried explaining modern currency. I said to the apparently empty parlor, "We don't use doubloons anymore. The electric company tends to prefer." A note materialized mid-air. "New nonsense. Money is money. Besides, the Admiral insists on paying his share, and he won't hear of modern scrip, as he calls it." As if summoned by the mention, 3 lead musket balls clattered down the chimney and rolled across the hearth, followed by a scrap of paper reading GF4 munitions maintenance. The clutter became untenable. I'd open a cupboard to find a pile of Civil War-era tokens where my tea bags should be. My laundry emerged from the dryer with antique buttons nestled in the folds. Once, I nearly choked on what I thought was a raisin in my oatmeal, only to spit out a tiny Roman coin onto my spoon. The accompanying note, stuck to the milk carton, read, Oye denarius for your thoughts. Worse still were the IUS. Every time he or one of their spectral friends borrowed something, a blanket folded into an impromptu ghostly hammock, a teacup used for seance purposes, they'd leave increasingly elaborate promissory notes. Mrs. Pembleton has requisitioned your yellow throw pillow for spiritual comfort. Repayment in kind to follow. The next morning I found the pillow returned with a cameo brooch pinned to it that made my fingers tingle when touched. Colonel requires your fire poker for a matter of honor. Expect recompense by dawn. It reappeared, bent into a perfect circle with no explanation. The breaking point came when I received an actual ledger. It appeared on my desk one evening, bound in cracked leather, its yellowed pages filled with columns of spidery handwriting, detailing every supposed transaction since E's arrival. April 3rd, 1 candle's worth of ectoplasm residue on ceiling. Credit, 2 farthings. June 17th. Unauthorized use of living occupants' bath salts. Debit, 1 shilling to be repaid in spectral favors. The final entry read, Balance due. Through ground 7 shillings and an apology. I slammed the ledger shut, only for it to pop open again at a new page where fresh ink was already forming. Plus interest, naturally. I said through gritted teeth, we need to talk about your financial literacy. A pause. Then the grandfather clock's door creaked open, and a cascade of coins came pouring out in a metallic avalanche. Pennies, guilders, a single buffalo nickel, followed by a note. Will this cover the discussion? I stared at the pile, then up at the ceiling. You're impossible. A new coin dropped onto my head, a smooth, worn stone with a hole in the center. The note that followed read, Actually, this is Z pre-money. I'm diversifying your portfolio. That night, as I lay in bed, something heavy settled at the foot of the covers. I lifted the blanket to find an iron strongbox, its lock rusted shut from centuries in some phantom vault. The note atop it read simply. I sighed and added exorcist to my mental grocery list, right below coin appraisal and strongbox removal. The next morning I awoke to find the strongbox gone, replaced by a single Confederate banknote and a new note. Upon reflection, perhaps we should discuss alternative payment structures. Would you accept haunting as a service? I buried my face in my hands. A had won again. Chapter 9. The Midnight Conversations. There is a special kind of exhaustion that comes from being woken at 3 in the morning to discuss the weather patterns of 1887. It is not the dramatic, haunted exhaustion of Gothic novels, no fevered cries about curses or wailing about lost loves, but the mundane, soul-deep weariness of a man who just wants 5 consecutive hours of sleep and instead finds himself debating whether Victorian umbrellas were truly superior to modern ones, with a ghost who considers midnight a perfectly reasonable hour for discourse. It began with subtle interruptions. I would drift off, only to be roused by the sensation of someone delicately clearing their throat near the foot of the bed. No visible specter, no icy breath on my neck. Just the persistent, polite wahem of a being that refused to acknowledge human sleep cycles. The first few times I ignored it. Then came the notes. A slip of paper would float down onto my chest, the handwriting becoming increasingly frantic the longer I pretended to sleep. Pardon the intrusion, but have you noticed the unusual chill in the air? The Admiral believes it portends rain, but I maintain it's merely seasonal. Another night. Do you recall where we stored the extra candles? The Mrs. Pembleton wishes to discuss the Crimean War, and one really must have proper lighting for such matters. The breaking point came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, when I was jolted awake by the distinct sensation of a quill pen tickling my earlobe. A note hovered inches from my face. Apologies for the urgency, but the Colonel has gotten into an argument with Dr. Holloway about the siege of Vicksburg, and we require an impartial arbitrator. Your military knowledge, while limited, is at least contemporary. I groaned into my pillow. I was in accounting. The quill scribbled a hasty addition. Yes, but you own a History Channel subscription. Thus began my reluctant tenure as the spectral world's midnight mediator. The topics ranged from baffling to bizarre. The ethics of using whalebone in corsets, apparently still a sore subject for Lady Whitson. Whether modern toasters were cheating compared to proper hearth toasting techniques, and, on one particularly surreal occasion, a 3-hour debate about the proper way to starch a cravat that left me weeping into my coffee at dawn. Worse still were the light-hearted interruptions. I'd be drifting off when the curtains would rustle without a breeze, followed by E's voice, or rather, the impression of a voice, like hearing words through a thick wall.
You don't mean to pry, but you've been sighing in your sleep. Would you care to discuss it? The Mrs. Pembleton makes an excellent spectral listening ear one night.
I tried every deterrent. Earplugs resulted in increasingly aggressive feather tickling. A white noise machine prompted a note about dishonoring the art of natural silence. Even locking my door did nothing. He simply slid notes underneath until I relented, each one more formally passive-aggressive than the last. She, understand you're currently mind-disposed, but if you might spare a moment at your earliest convenience, the Colonel has threatened to haunt the downstairs water closet, unless someone validates his opinions on Napoleonic naval tactics. The lowest point came during a full moon, when I was awoken by the distinct sensation of someone, or something, plucking at my blanket like a nervous child. I opened my eyes to find the room filled with floating notepaper, each bearing some variation of "Gare you awake" in increasingly elaborate calligraphy. At the center hovered a single, ominous sheet. The Admiral has brought his diorama of the Battle of Trafalgar. It's very detailed. You may wish to dress for the occasion. I stared at the note. Then, at the spectral gleam beginning to form at the foot of my bed. Then, with the resignation of a man who had long since lost control of his own home, I reached for my robe. As I shuffled into the parlor, the grandfather clock struck 3:45 a.m. The room had been transformed into a war room. Maps floated in midair. Tiny ghostly ships bobbed in an imaginary sea above the coffee table, and the Admiral's voice, or what I assumed was the Admiral's voice, it sounded like a tea kettle attempting Shakespeare. Boom! Da resident expert arrives. Tell me, sir, does your modern Navy still use broadside tactics, or... I collapsed onto the sofa. Somewhere to my left, a teacup materialized in midair and began filling itself with what I hoped was spectral chamomile. His latest note fluttered into my lap. We'll make a historian of you yet. I sipped the tea. It tasted like lavender and resignation. Around me, the ghosts debated naval history with the fervor of men who had nothing but time. And as the first hints of dawn crept through the curtains, I realized with dawning horror that I was starting to enjoy these conversations. A damned polite, persistent soul had won again. Chapter 10. The Haunted Handshake. There's something uniquely disturbing about shaking hands with nothing. Not the unsettling void of empty air, but the very specific sensation of gripping fingers that are both present and not. The clammy, incorporeal pressure of a ghost determined to maintain proper social graces. It began on a Tuesday morning. I was halfway through my coffee when the air before me shimmered like heat over pavement, and a note materialized just above the kitchen table. Good morning. I trust you slept well. Before I could respond, the space beside the note darkened, and a hand extended toward me, pale, translucent, with fingers slightly curled, in perfect handshake. I stared. The hand remained. I said carefully, "Are you trying to shake my hand?" The hand wiggled its fingers expectantly. The note flipped over to reveal new text. Proper introductions require proper greetings. The Admiral insists. With the resignation of a man who had long since surrendered to the absurdity of his life, I reached out. The moment my fingers made contact, an icy tingle shot up my arm. Not painful, but deeply unnatural, like plunging one's hand into a snowbank, only to find the snow somehow gripping back. The sensation lingered even after the spectral hand withdrew, leaving my fingers faintly numb and smelling of lavender. A new note appeared. Your grip is adequate, though your palm was somewhat clammy. Might I suggest a handkerchief? Thus began what I can only describe as the most unsettling ritual of my existence. Every morning, without fail, E's hand would materialize somewhere in the house. Beside the toaster, through the bathroom door, once even emerging from the refrigerator beside the orange juice, waiting to perform its daily greeting. The Admiral's hand soon joined the rotation, his handshake firmer, but with an alarming tendency to linger just a second too long. The Mrs. Pemberton offered only her fingertips in a delicate half-grasp that somehow left my skin tingling for hours. The worst was the Colonel. His handshake wasn't a handshake at all, but what he called a proper military grip, a crushing, two-handed affair where his second spectral palm clamped over our already joined hands, like a vice. The first time it happened, I nearly toppled over from the sudden weight of unseen force. The note that followed read, "Colonel wishes you to know that any man who cannot withstand a true warrior's clasp is no man at all. He also suggests you take up calisthenics." I tried avoiding the ritual. I took to sneaking through my own home like a burglar, ducking under floating notes and sidestepping patches of suspiciously cold air. But E was relentless. A hand would emerge from a wall just as I passed. Another would rise up through the floorboards beside my favorite armchair. Once, in a moment of true desperation, I attempted to exit through the back garden, only to find 7 spectral hands arranged in a perfect receiving line along the path, each with a hovering name tag, Wadril, Colonel H, Mrs. P, and so on, ending with Gay, Everard, Esquire. The breaking point came when I realized the handshakes had evolved. No longer content with simple greetings, E and company had begun using them to communicate. A squeeze during dinner meant mute-eye carrots are overcooked. 2 quick pumps while I read meant me this book is overdue at the Spectral Library. The Colonel developed an entire Morse code system of taps and pressures that usually translated to criticisms about my posture or comments on current military affairs. One rainy afternoon, as I sat trying to enjoy a rare moment of solitude, E's hand materialized beside me and performed what I can only describe as a consolatory pat on my forearm. A note followed, "You seem melancholy. The Mrs. Pemberton recommends lavender tea and a brisk haunting to lift your spirits." I stared at the note, then at the still visible hand hovering patiently near my elbow. Something in me snapped. This is absurd. You're a ghost, I'm alive. We don't need to shake hands." The hand recoiled as if struck. The note crumpled slightly at the edges, as though gripped by an unseen force. Then slowly, new writing appeared. "One must maintain standards, even in death, if we abandon civility. What separates us from common shades?" I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. The hand was still there, fingers slightly curled, waiting. With a sigh, I reached out. The grip was cooler than usual, almost hesitant. The moment our hands touched, the grandfather clock in the hall, which hadn't worked in years, suddenly chimed once. The hand squeezed gently, then faded away. A final note fluttered down. "Thank you. Tomorrow, perhaps we might practice the proper bow. The Admiral has strong opinions about spinal alignment." I groaned and dropped my head into my hands. Somewhere in the walls, I could hear the faint sound of someone, or something, practicing their curtsy. A had won again. Chapter 11. The Ghostly Gift Giver. The first gift arrived on a Tuesday morning. A single, wilted daisy laid precisely in the center of my breakfast plate, its petals drooping in what might have been a gesture of romantic melancholy if not for the note tucked beneath it.
The Mrs. Pemberton thought you might appreciate some floral cheer. Do mind the aphids? I lifted the flower, only to have it disintegrate.
This, I would learn, was his newest fixation, gift-giving. Not useful gifts, of course. No spectral replacement for the light bulbs they kept flickering. No ghostly assistance with the dishes they kept rearranging. But the kind of presence that suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of both human needs and the concept of tangible objects. The Admiral started it. I came home to find a rusted naval button on my pillow, accompanied by a note explaining that it had seen the Battle of the Nile and would make a splendid conversation piece. The Colonel followed suit with what appeared to be a petrified biscuit from the Crimean War, displayed proudly on my desk like a museum artifact. Still edible in a pinch, his note claimed. Even the Mrs. Pemberton got involved, leaving yellowed lace handkerchiefs in my coat pockets that made cashiers hand them back to me with sympathetic looks. He, naturally, took this as a challenge. Gifts began appearing daily, each more confounding than the last. A moth-eaten cravat draped over my bedroom doorknob. To lend your evening attire some dignity. A collection of smooth river stones arranged in a circle on the kitchen counter. The Admiral swears by their calming properties. A single cracked teacup placed deliberately in the center of the dining table. These survived the Blitz. Do try not to break it. The worst were the books. Not readable books, no modern novels or useful reference guides, but crumbling, foxed volumes with titles like A Treatise on the Proper Storage of Jam and Moral Rectitude for the Modern Gentleman, 1837. Edition, they materialized in stacks by my bedside, on the toilet tank, once even balanced precariously atop the shower head, each with a note extolling their... I tried donating them, only to find them back on my shelves the next day, their spines stiff with spectral disapproval. I attempted gratitude. "Thank you for the rock collection," I said to the empty parlor after one particularly baffling delivery. The room grew several degrees colder, the ghostly equivalent of beaming pride, before a new note fluttered onto the mantel. "You're most welcome. The Admiral has suggested we next gift you his collection of naval knots. They're quite educational." The breaking point came when I awoke to find my bedroom transformed into what could only be described as a Victorian curiosity shop. Seashells lined the windowsill. A stuffed bird, possibly an owl, though time had not been kind to its features, perched atop my dresser. The walls were hung with yellowed maps of places that no longer existed, and at the foot of my bed sat a wooden chest overflowing with what appeared to be antique buttons. A note hung from the bedpost. "Way. Noticed your living space lacked a gravitas. Please enjoy our collective Yobiets d'art. The Colonel's cavalry spurs are in the bottom drawer should you wish to accessorize." I stared at the chest, then at the owl, then at the door, through which I could hear the faint sounds of an argument about whether my study needed more thematic cohesion. "I called, my voice teetering between laughter and despair. "This is too much." Silence. Then, from beneath the bed, a single sheet of paper slid into view. "In nonsense, every gentleman needs a curated environment. Tomorrow we shall discuss your unfortunate lack of ectrophies." That night, as I attempted to sleep beneath the glassy gaze of the mystery owl, I realized with dawning horror that I was growing accustomed to the gifts. The button collection had a certain rustic charm. The maps were almost interesting, and the seashells, while dusty, did catch the light nicely. The next morning, I awoke to find a new addition to my growing menagerie, a framed silhouette of a stern-looking man with mutton chops, hanging crookedly above my dresser. The note beside it read, "Oh, great Uncle Thaddeus. Not ye technically your ancestor, but we felt you needed some familial presence. His ghost is terrifying, so do try to keep him happy." I sighed and adjusted the frame. Some battles weren't worth fighting. He, damn their generous, misguided soul, had won again. Chapter 12. The Overly Considerate Apparition. There is something uniquely absurd about witnessing a ghost tiptoe. Not the dramatic floating glide of storybooks, but the exaggerated cartoonish creep of a being that has misunderstood the fundamental nature of its own incorporeality. I first noticed it on a Thursday evening when I caught sight of E attempting to sneak through the parlor wall, shoulders hunched, spectral feet lifted high with each step, moving at a pace that suggested they were navigating a floor covered in bubble wrap, rather than passing effortlessly through solid matter. When they noticed me watching, they froze mid-step, their translucent face flushing a pale gray in what I assumed was supernatural embarrassment. A note promptly materialized at my feet. Apologies for the intrusion. I was attempting to be unobtrusive. This, it turned out, was E's latest obsession. Not just politeness, but an almost pathological consideration for my delicate mortal sensibilities. Doors that had once swung open on their own now inched ajar with excruciating slowness, accompanied by the faintest yahem of spectral warning. Objects no longer floated, they drifting as though carried by the world's most timid poltergeist. Even the temperature drops, once dramatic enough to warrant a sweater, had softened to what E's notes called a gentle autumnal suggestion, rather than proper haunted house chill. The Admiral took it furthest. Where he had once barreled through walls with nautical enthusiasm, he now paused at each surface, rapping gently with an unseen knuckle before murmuring cheap permission to come aboard, and waiting a full 3 seconds before proceeding. The Colonel developed an elaborate system of announcing his presence by rattling the coat rack once for entering, twice for passing through, and 3 times for lingering with intent, though he frequently forgot which was which, resulting in what sounded like a deranged Morse code transmission. The breaking point came at 3 a.m., when I was awakened by the sensation of someone or something hovering anxiously beside my bed. I opened my eyes to find the air above me shimmering with what looked like ghostly indecision. After a full minute of this, a note floated down onto my chest. Dreadfully sorry to disturb you, but the kitchen faucet is dripping. Might we trouble you to address it at your earliest convenience? We do it ourselves, but the Admiral fears the noise might startle you. I stared at the ceiling. I said, my voice thick with sleep. You're ghosts. You literally cannot startle me anymore. I've seen the Colonel try to microwave a scone. Nothing phases me now. A pause. Then from the hallway came the sound of the coat rack rattling 7 times in rapid succession before the Colonel's voice, or what I assumed was the Colonel's voice. It sounded like a stiff breeze through a harmonica, mumbled bloody modern contraptions, followed by the distinct kite pampa of an invisible forehead meeting a wall. By week's end, the house had become a study in supernatural restraint. The Mrs. Pembleton had taken to floating behind me with a handkerchief at the ready, in case I sneezed. Developed a habit of dimming lights by infinitesimal degrees so as not to jar the senses. Even the grandfather clock's chime had been softened to what the Admiral called more maritime appropriate ding, though in practice it just made the hours sound apologetic. The absurdity peaked during what I can only describe as a spectral intervention. I returned home to find all the chairs in the parlor arranged in a circle, each occupied by the faint shimmer of a ghost, trying very hard to look supportive. A note on the coffee table read, "We've noticed you've been sighing heavily near the wallpaper. Would you care to discuss your decor grievances? We're very willing to compromise on the wainscoting." I looked at the wallpaper, a hideous floral pattern that had come with the house, then the anxious air molecules arranged around the room. With a sigh that made the Mrs. Pembleton's handkerchief flutter in sympathy, I sat down. "Fine, but if we're redecorating, we're getting rid of Great Uncle Thaddeus." The silhouette in the hallway fell off the wall with a clatter. Somewhere in the kitchen, the Admiral began to protest before being shushed by what sounded like an entire ghostly committee. A new note appeared in my lap. "Will, take it under advisement." I hid a smile. Maybe, just maybe, I was starting to win. Then the Colonel's voice rasped from the ceiling. "Ye still say that microwave had it coming. Eh, damn their considerate, impossible soul had drawn me into their madness yet again." Chapter 13. The Ghost Who Remembers Your Birthday. I had hoped, somewhat naively, that death might have eroded E's sense of time. But as I learned on the morning of my 32nd birthday, ghosts possess an impeccable, and frankly unsettling, memory for dates. I awoke to the sound of whispering, not the usual spectral murmurs floating through walls, but a hushed, anticipatory rustling, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The moment my eyelids fluttered open, the bedroom curtains flew apart with dramatic flair, revealing a banner that had most certainly not been there the night before. Strung across the window in ornate, slightly yellowed calligraphy, it read, "Felicitations on your natal day." Below it, dangling from the curtain rod by what looked like cobwebs, hung a cluster of spectral balloons, translucent orbs that bobbed weightlessly without any discernible breeze. A note materialized on my pillow. "Why the household wishes you the very happiest of birthdays. Please join us in the dining room at your earliest convenience for celebratory refreshments. Yours in merriment, E. Everard and Company." The refreshments, it turned out, were an elaborate charade of ghostly hospitality. The dining table had been set with my best china, which I didn't own, each plate bearing a slice of invisible cake that nonetheless gave off the faint aroma of vanilla. The centerpiece was a towering confection of spectral frosting, complete with hovering candles that burned without flame or heat. As I stared, the air above the cake shimmered, and a chorus of voices, some warbling, some whistling, one that sounded suspiciously like a kazoo, launched into a painfully off-key rendition of Happy Birthday in what I guessed was Victorian English. "Happiest of days to thee. Yea, happiest of days. Happiest of days to thee. My, that cheer ne'er fade." The song trailed off as E's hand materialized just long enough to place a party hat on my head, a cone of fragile tissue paper that immediately dissolved into mist the moment it touched my hair. A new note appeared beside my coffee cup. "Mrs. Pembleton crafted that by hand in 1873. Do make an effort to appreciate it." Gifts followed, each more baffling than the last. The Admiral presented me with a ship's log from 1812. Fine reading, if one ignores the mutiny chapters. The Colonel bestowed upon me what appeared to be a petrified lemon, carried through the siege of Sevastopol, tremendous morale booster. The Mrs. Pembleton's offering was a lace doily with my initials embroidered in ghostly thread that vanished when touched. His gift came last, a pocket watch that had no discernible gears or hands, just a faint ticking sound that seemed to originate from inside my own skull when I held it. The note read, "Time is but a construct, yet we find comfort in its passage. Do try not to lose this one." I blinked at the watch, then at the empty air where he presumably stood waiting for my reaction. "Thank you," I said with all the sincerity I could muster. "It's very thoughtful." The watch immediately grew several degrees colder in my palm, the ghostly equivalent of beaming pride. The celebration might have been tolerable had it ended there. But ghosts, I learned, take birthdays seriously. Throughout the day, unexpected surprises manifested at every turn. A disembodied hand offered me invisible champagne while I brushed my teeth. The bathroom mirror spelled out many happy returns in condensation every time it fogged. Even my afternoon nap was interrupted by the Admiral bellowing sea shanties from inside the walls. The breaking point came at midnight, when I stumbled to the kitchen for water, only to find the entire spectral gathering still in full swing. The invisible cake had been consumed, leaving behind only the faint scent of sugar and existential dread. The colonel was arguing with the admiral about proper birthday artillery salutes. Apparently 1 cannon per year of life was standard. And hovering at the center of it all was a new note, written in E's most formal script. Do hope you've enjoyed your special day. We've taken the liberty of planning next year's festivities. The Mrs. Pembleton suggests a masquerade, while the colonel insists on a military parade. Perhaps a compromise? I stared at the note, then at the empty chairs that were somehow still radiating celebratory energy. I said slowly, how do you even know my birthday? The house fell silent. The floating notes paused mid-drift. Then, from the direction of the pantry, came the sound of frantic scribbling. A final note slid across the floor toward me. One makes it one's business to know these things about one's dearest companions. Now, about that parade, shall we say 12 cannons or 15? I sighed and rubbed my temples. Somewhere in the walls, the admiral began practicing his trumpet. Damn their attentive undead soul, had already begun planning for next year. Chapter 14. The poltergeist who cleans up after itself. There is something uniquely absurd about watching a ghost apologize to a broken vase. Not the human act of contrition, no mumbled words or sheepish glances, but the theatrical, drawn-out spectacle of E's supernatural remorse. I first witnessed this phenomenon a Tuesday afternoon, when I walked into the parlor just in time to see a candlestick float off the mantel, hover uncertainly for a moment, then deliberately hurl itself to the floor with a dramatic crash. Before the porcelain shards had even settled, the air above them shimmered with what I can only describe as ghostly panic. A note materialized mid-air, fluttering like a startled bird before landing atop the wreckage. Dreadfully sorry about that. The colonel was attempting to demonstrate proper saber technique and quite forgot his surroundings. We shall rectify this immediately. Profoundest apologies, E. As I watched, the candlestick righted itself with exaggerated care. The porcelain fragments levitated in a slow ceremonial dance back to their original positions, each piece clicking into place with unnatural precision. Within moments, the vase stood whole again, looking as though it had never been shattered, except for a faint ectoplasmic sheen that made it glow slightly in the afternoon light. Another note appeared beside it. "We there. Good as new. Might we suggest avoiding sudden movements near the mantel for the next 24 hours while the spiritual adhesive sets?" Thus began what I came to think of as the era of conscientious haunting. Where once E and company had been merely polite, they now approached every supernatural mishap with the solemnity of a funeral procession. The Admiral's enthusiastic cannonball reenactments in the upstairs hallway, a recent obsession, were always followed by painstaking repairs to the plaster, complete with notes explaining the exact composition of 18th century wall materials, and how these compared favorably to modern papier-mâché. The colonel's experiments with improved cavalry charges through the kitchen left no lasting damage, just a lingering smell of gunpowder and lengthy treatises on proper floorboard maintenance. Even the Mrs. Pembleton got in on the act. Her habit of rearranging my books according to proper moral character, Dickens always at eye level, modern paperbacks discreetly hidden behind potted ferns, was now preceded by flowery notes of intent and followed by exhaustive catalogues of her organizational system. I once returned home to find my entire library shifted 2 inches to the left, with a 20-page explanation pinned to the shelf detailing how this improved spiritual circulation. The breaking point came during what I can only describe as a supernatural mea culpa. I awoke at 3 a.m. to the sound of whispering and the unmistakable clink of silverware. Creeping downstairs, I found the dining room transformed into a spectral courtroom. The silverware floated in neat rows like jurors. The good china sat in solemn judgment. And at the center of it all, a single teaspoon hovered above the table, its bowl drooping in what looked like shame. His voice, or rather the impression of E's voice, like words formed from a cold draught, echoed through the room. Why the accused stands charged with the unlawful scalding of the living occupant during tea service on October the 12th. How is the defendant plead? The teaspoon gave a feeble rattle. We shall take that as guilty. The court acknowledges the defendant's previous service and notes the scalding was, by human standards, merely uncomfortable rather than medically significant. However, I cleared my throat. The silverware clattered in surprise. A note immediately zoomed toward me. Wura apologies for the disturbance. Justice must be seen to be done, even in spectral matters. Will be done shortly. As I watched, the teaspoon was sentenced to 1 week's demotion to coffee service and ordered to issue a formal apology to all affected parties. It floated over to me and performed what looked like a somersault, the ghostly equivalent of a bowed head, before retreating to the silverware drawer with a penitent clink. I rubbed my eyes. It's a spoon. The air grew several degrees colder. His version of a huff. Another note appeared. Principles are principles. Besides, the Admiral still hasn't forgiven the soup tureen for Trafalgar. By week's end, I found myself oddly comforted by the ritual. There was something almost soothing about the predictability of it all. The way every supernatural accident was followed by earnest repair. Every mistake met with overwrought accountability. When the Colonel's quick demonstration of cavalry tactics left hoof marks on the ceiling, I didn't even blink when a ladder appeared of its own accord and a ghostly rag began scrubbing furiously. The note left behind said it all. Why the Colonel wishes it known that the marks are historically accurate for a charge of that nature, but concedes they may be somewhat out of place in a modern domicile. He remains available for further demonstrations upon request, though suggests you might prefer the garden next time. I looked at the now pristine ceiling, then at the faint shimmer near the ladder that I'd come to recognize as E's pleased expression. Just keep him away from the good china, I muttered. The teaspoon in the drawer rattled in agreement. Damn their conscientious, impossible soul, had turned even chaos into something resembling order. Chapter 15. The Ghost Who Asks Permission to Haunt. There's something fundamentally wrong about filling out paperwork to be frightened. Yet this was precisely the situation I found myself in when E developed their latest obsession, procedural haunting. It began with a notice slipped under my bedroom door at dawn. Not the usual scrap of paper, but an official-looking document titled, Your Request for Supernatural Activity, Form SP 1892, complete with numbered lines and a space for my signature. The listed proposed haunting was described as a mild atmospheric chilling, or prox a 5-7-degree reduction, in the parlor between the hours of 2:00 and 4:00 p.m., to be accompanied by optional mournful sighing, volume adjustable upon request at the bottom. In crisp, bureaucratic script it read, By the signing below, the undersigned agrees to the above. I stared at the form. The form, being paper, did not stare back. I called to the empty hallway. This is ridiculous. A reply appeared instantly, written in midair by an unseen hand using ink that faded as I read it. Proper haunting requires proper consent. The Admiral insists we modernize our methods. Thus began the most bureaucratic haunting in supernatural history. Gone were the spontaneous cold spots, the sudden apparitions. Now every eerie occurrence required triplicate paperwork and a waiting period. When the Mrs. Pembleton wished to rearrange my books according to spiritual alignment, I first had to approve a material rearrangement disclosure detailing which titles would be moved, and why, Dickens, it turned out, had excellent ectoplasmic resonance. The Colonel's attempts to demonstrate cavalry maneuvers through the kitchen were now preceded by liability waivers and equipment checklists. Number of spectral horses, 4. Expected duration, 12 minutes. Will be carrying sabers? Yes,
No.
The breaking point came when I found a clipboard hanging from my bedroom doorknob bearing a notification of intent to apparate form. The description read, "Oi brief semi-transparent manifestation in hallway mirror, duration not to exceed 8 seconds, for purposes of general supernatural ambience. Checkbox if you would prefer Victorian morning attire versus standard evening wear." I threw the clipboard down in exasperation, only for it to levitate back up, a pen hovering helpfully near the signature line. I groaned. "You're a ghost. The whole point is that you're supposed to be scary." The air grew several degrees colder, not in a menacing way, but in the manner of a disappointed bureaucrat. A new form materialized on the coffee table. Complaint regarding lack of frightfulness, Form 1897, line 5 read, "Please describe desired level of terror."
Mild unease, pleasant shiver and blood-curdling dread. Additional waiver required. Additional waiver required.
I should have refused. I should have burned the forms. Instead, with the resignation of a man who had long since surrendered to the absurdity of his existence, I initialed the box for pleasant shiver and signed my name with a flourish. The haunting that followed was the most polite in recorded history. Precisely at the appointed time, the hallway mirror fogged over, just enough to suggest a presence, but not so much as to obscure one's reflection entirely. The sigh, when it came, was perfectly modulated, audible enough to be atmospheric, but quiet enough not to startle. As promised, it was in a minor key. When the 8 seconds elapsed, the mirror cleared. A final note appeared on the now blank form. "Wine, thank you for participating in today's scheduled supernatural event. Your satisfaction is very important to us. Please rate this haunting. Excellent. Good, adequate, needs improvement." I stared at the choices. Then, with a sigh of my own, I checked excellent. The pen floated up and drew a little smiley face next to my selection. Damn their bureaucratic, impossible soul had turned even horror into something resembling customer service. Chapter 16. The Spectral Socialite. I should have known better than to host a dinner party in a haunted house. Not because of the usual concerns, floating cutlery or sudden chills, but because E had developed the unfortunate habit of considering himself the host. The first warning came when I found the guest list rewritten in elegant calligraphy on my refrigerator, with the Honorable Everett Cantey added beneath my friends' names. A note beside it read, "Want see Mrs. Pembleton has requested the salmon course. The Admiral requires naval-themed place cards. Kindly provide a seating chart at your earliest convenience." I tried reasoning with the empty kitchen. This is a casual gathering. We're ordering pizza." The refrigerator door flew open of its own accord. A new note, written in what I'd come to recognize as E's offended script, appeared on the milk carton. "Cone does not serve pizza to guests without at least 3 proper courses. We shall handle the menu." By the day of the party, my modest apartment had been transformed into something resembling a Victorian dining hall. The coffee table now bore a laced tablecloth that smelled faintly of mothballs. My mismatched chairs had been replaced, temporarily, I hoped, with high back seats that seemed to adjust their height depending on who, or what, sat in them. And hovering above the buffet was an entire ghostly ice sculpture of what appeared to be the Admiral's schooner, melting without ever dripping. My friends arrived to find me standing stiffly by the door, whispering warnings. "Just ignore the floating silverware," I muttered, as Jenna handed me a bottle of wine. "If the napkins rearrange themselves, don't mention it. And for God's sake, don't compliment the decor. He's been insufferable all day about the centerpiece." Mark, ever the skeptic, laughed. "Come on. You're really still doing this ghost bit?" At that precise moment, his wine glass levitated from his hand, and poured itself with impeccable precision. The air beside him shimmered, and a calling card materialized in mid-air. "Everard Esquire, your servant, sir." Mark's face went the color of the Admiral's best claret. Dinner was a study in controlled chaos. The pizza I'd ordered arrived, only to be immediately supplemented by ghostly side dishes that vanished when touched. The Admiral held court at one end of the table, his booming voice, or what sounded like a foghorn attempting elocution, regaling everyone with tales of nautical daring. The Misses Pembleton kept attempting to improve people's posture by yanking on the backs of their collars. And he himself seemed to be everywhere at once, refilling glasses that were still half full, adjusting chairs, once even attempting to mediate when an argument broke out about modern art. His note, "God, Colonel, finds your interpretation ye fascinating, though entirely wrong." The breaking point came during dessert, when the spectral ice sculpture began playing a jaunty sea shanty, and the chandelier, which I didn't own, started swaying in time. Jenna, who by this point had consumed enough wine to find the whole situation hilarious, raised her glass to our invisible hosts. The room erupted in applause, both from the living guests and from what sounded like a dozen ghostly hands clapping from every direction at once. Silverware rose in a toast. Napkins fluttered like celebratory flags. And in the center of it all, the pizza box lifted solemnly into the air, its lid opening to reveal a new note. "We do hope you've enjoyed this evening's entertainment. Enclosed, please find our card. We're available for weddings, funerals, and other social engagements. Seats. The Admiral suggests more cannon fire next time." As my friend staggered out hours later, Mark still occasionally poking at the air where the wineglass had floated, I slumped against the doorframe. The house was already cleaning itself, plates stacking, chairs writing, ghostly silverware polishing itself with invisible rags. A final note fluttered down onto my shoulder. "A most successful gathering, if we do say so ourselves. The Mrs. Pembleton has already begun planning our next soiree. She suggests a masquerade. To start considering costumes." I looked at the note, then at the now spotless apartment, then at the faint shimmer near the ceiling that I'd come to recognize as E's self-satisfied expression. With a sigh, I went to find my laptop. "Fine," I muttered, "but if we're doing a masquerade, we're getting real food this time." The oven turned on by itself in response. Damn sociable, impossible soul, had turned my social life into a cross-dimensional event. Chapter 17. The Ghost Who Overstays Its Welcome. There comes a time in every haunting when one must face an uncomfortable truth. Ghosts, like houseguests, eventually wear out their welcome. The realization crept up on me slowly. Between finding admirals, spectral barnacles clogging my shower drain, the Colonel's midnight cavalry drills rattling my fillings loose, and the Mrs. Pembleton's insistence on tucking me into bed each night with a lullaby that hadn't been popular since the Crimean War. But the breaking point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, when I opened my refrigerator to find E had alphabetized my condiments, e.g. historical significance. "No, Pimby." I said to the empty kitchen, "We need to talk." The air grew still. A single note fluttered down from the ceiling fan, landing with all the finality of a resigned sigh. "We've been expecting this." That evening, the house prepared for what I could only describe as a supernatural intervention. The parlor chairs arranged themselves in a solemn circle. The Admiral's best brandy, which I didn't own, materialized on the sideboard. Even Great-Uncle Thaddeus' portrait tilted forward attentively from its place on the wall. He manifested properly for the first time, not just a floating note or a disembodied hand, but a full, if slightly translucent figure, a gentleman of indeterminate age in a frock coat that had gone out of style before electricity was invented. He perched stiffly on the edge of the sofa, wringing his spectral hat between his hands. "It's not that I haven't enjoyed your company," I began carefully. The Mrs. Pembleton's lace handkerchief fluttered in agreement from the mantel. But perhaps it's time to consider moving on? The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for funerals and failed soufflés. His form flickered. Move on? His voice was less a sound and more the impression of one, like wind through an abandoned hallway. But who will remind you to rotate your mattress quarterly? Who will ensure the Admiral doesn't reenact the Battle of Trafalgar in your attic? I risk the unrotated mattress. The Colonel's saber clattered to the floor in protest. What followed was the most polite argument in supernatural history. He produced a 17-point list, complete with footnotes, on why his continued presence was not only beneficial but necessary. I countered with the time he'd helpfully exercised my microwave for being too modern. The Admiral floated logbooks proving ghosts improved property values. I had brought up the incident with the haunted handshake that left my right arm numb for a week. The debate might have lasted centuries, if not for the Mrs. Pembleton, who suddenly materialized in a flutter of lace and disapproval. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Everett," she scolded, her voice like the creak of a rocking chair. "The living chap has a point. We've been dead for ages." His translucent shoulders slumped. But where would we go? It was then I realized the terrible truth. He wasn't being difficult. He was scared. The solution came to me at 3 a.m., as all terrible ideas do. I found he hovering mournfully by the grandfather clock, attempting, and failing, to wind it with his non-corporeal hands. "What if," I ventured, "you haunted somewhere more your style?" He sat stopped mid-ring. 2 weeks later I stood on the steps of the local historical society, watching as the Admiral, the Colonel, and the Mrs. Pembleton took formal possession of their new home. The director, a frazzled woman named Margaret, had jumped at the offer of period-appropriate spectral docents when I demonstrated E's ability to make tea sets float in perfect formation. As I turned to leave, a final note materialized in my coat pocket. "You will visit Sundays? The Admiral's planned a maritime exhibit, and the Colonel insists you witness his tactical reenactments. Do bring biscuits." I smiled. Somewhere behind me, a ghostly hand waved farewell, then promptly went back to alphabetizing the 19th century porcelain. Damn his impossible particular soul, had finally found a home worthy of his standards, and I, at long last, could finally drink my coffee without it being corrected to the proper temperature for 1874.